Dr. Debra Soh is a former sex researcher and the author of The End of Gender. In the book, she debunks 9 myths about gender ideology. I'm personally a huge fan of Dr. Debra. She is absolutely amazing, brave, nuanced, sweet, and one of the most important voices in today's political climate. But first, I'm curious to know, why did you write the book?
I am a sex neuroscientist by training. I left academia because I'd written this op-ed that was critical of gender transitioning in children. This was back when I was still doing my PhD. And upon publishing that, I knew that I wouldn't be able to continue in academia. It's only this issue and the science of gender has only gotten more political since I left academia. So I now work as a science journalist. My first book, The End of Gender, came out with Simon and Schuster. I would say one of the main inspirations was the number of parents who were reaching out to me, asking me questions about what does the science actually say about these issues, because they were dealing with it in their kids' education. So the book came out in 2020. At that time, I would say gender ideology was an education, but people weren't really talking as much about it. And I don't think parents were necessarily even as aware of the extent to which it was being pushed in their children's education, because teachers are very good at hiding this, and also because these ideas are so nonsensical and crazy that I don't think any rational person would understandably think that this would be taught to children, because it's so ridiculous. Like, to teach children that you pick your own gender, that there are more than 2 genders, that sex is biological sex is a social construct, even that gender is a social construct. That's not true. And so they would say to me, I go to meet with the principal or I meet with the board, and they tell me that the newest science backs up these ideas. So I'm at a loss. I don't know how to argue with that. So I wrote the book as a resource for them. Even if you were to bring legitimate studies to, say, teachers or the heads of schools, I question whether they would even really care, because I think some of them are not everyone, because I hear from teachers all the time telling me they disagree with this, but I think there are many who are very much social justice minded, and they are so invested in this ideology and teaching it to kids. So I don't even know that it would make a difference. But for people who are just curious to understand what the truth is, I think it's important that we know what reality is. That's why I wrote it.
As you all know, if you dare to stand up against wokeness, you will receive a lot of hate. Not only will you receive hate, some activists will try to ruin your reputation by lying about you. Some of Deborah's haters call her a right-wing extremist, even though she's a liberal, and they also call her science fake science. How ironic. But what I'm curious to know is, how did people generally react to her book and her statements?
I would say the most important thing for me was that trans people actually reached out to me. And I remember, I think you did like a little social media clip, and that meant so much, because that was my biggest concern with the book. I wanted to be accurate in terms of what the science had to say, but I also wanted to be very clear that what I'm saying should not be used to discriminate against anyone, to marginalize people, and especially not the trans community. I do think trans people, I'm not trans, but I do think that trans people experience discrimination and it's unfair. And I support transitioning in adults. And I think adults should be able to get access to care and support. And, to hear from so many trans people telling me that they understood that message and that they didn't think the book was, all these awful things that people have been calling it. So that was very important to me. I would say I got got some backlash, from people who probably didn't read the book. My sense, I can tell when someone is angrily tweeting at me or leaving nasty reviews of the book. I can usually tell whether they've actually read it or not, just because when you write a book, you put so much time and energy and really like your life and your heart into it. So I can tell when the criticisms they try to make it sound like they've read it, but they haven't. And I think it's people who are really, like I said, with the earlier issue with people who are teaching this to kids. I think some people are just so invested in the ideology, or they genuinely think that this is what's going to help trans people if they aren't trans themselves, that they're one of those so-called allies. And so they see someone like me as a threat. But what I found really interesting is that some of the criticism, people were claiming I said things either in the book or just that I believe things that I don't believe. And I very, very clearly say that I don't believe those things. And in the book, I clearly state that do not use what I'm saying here to justify this view. But there are people who will claim that I have these views. And at first I wasn't really sure why they would do that, because I thought, well, you're not really helping the cause by by lying. But then I realized I don't think for some people it's even about really helping anyone. It's really about them. They have a personal mission and they're just trying to tear other people down. So it was, it's been a very interesting experience for me. I'm very grateful for all the opportunities I've had. I don't ever want to seem like I'm complaining. I really think, I feel so strongly about these issues as well, and especially the kids. I really care a lot about kids with gender dysphoria getting the help that they really need, that's actually going to target whatever issue they're dealing with, and not band-aid solutions that are ultimately going to harm them in the long term potentially. So it's all been worth it. That's what I would say.
So we were on a Twitter space recently on this panel, and there's some trans activists not so happy to hear you speak. I was just so surprised how she like interrupted you and called you an idiot, I think, and I'm like,
Useful idiot.
I mean, regardless if you are, because if you're not a conservative, you're a useful idiot for conservatives. But the point is
That's
that
very helpful.
oh,
Useful is
okay.
useful.
They don't really watch our content, read our stuff, and all of this. They just know that they have to hate us.
Because they aren't challenged. Like, I don't want to speak specifically to this one activist who is very, I would say, quite aggressive. I was surprised actually, because I went in and I wasn't expecting someone to be so hostile outright. Like, it was probably within the first 2 or 3 minutes of me speaking, but that's fine. I'm used to that. That's not the first time that's happened. But I think because the mainstream really props up a particular perspective, people who hold those views are never being challenged. My sense is if you are holding dominant views, there's probably a part of you, or the majority of people don't really feel incentivized to look for conflicting information or disconfirming information, because they're just going along with what people are telling them they should believe. So with the activists, I think they probably have different reasons than the average person who was going along with these ideas. They're not actually watching or listening to the content. They're just simply making an opinion based on their preconceived ideas, or what their friends are telling them about it. Or I feel there's a real lack of nuance also with this debate, in that if you have any hesitation that that's immediately hateful, or that you immediately must be silenced, and there's no way of saying, yes, all these points are true, but we should also look at the fact that maybe this isn't the right path for some people. That's not to say it's not the right path for everyone, but you can't say that it's the right path in every single case, and that people for whom it didn't work out, they don't exist or they don't matter.
It's not only trans activists who claim that there are more than two biological sexes. I've heard it from a lot of regular people as well. A lot of regular people say to me, well, aren't there people who are born with both? So there is a third sex, right? Well, Dr. Debra, is biological sex a spectrum?
Well, so there are two sexes, as you mentioned, they're male and female. And I think the existence of intersex people does not discount that. I think it's very important that we support and respect intersex people, and also bodily autonomy. I do agree that, say, children with an intersex condition should be allowed to have that autonomy and make their own decisions about their bodies when they're of an age where they are able to consent. And if they decide that they don't want to undergo any interventions, then that should be totally fine too. But yeah, I do see activists pointing to the intersex community and saying that because there are some people who have a combination of both male and female anatomy, that this is a sign that sex is a spectrum. I really don't, I can't speak for these activists, but I don't know that they really care about the community. My sense is they really are just grasping at any potential examples to prove their point. And if it were the case that sex were a spectrum, then they would probably argue that it's binary. Like, I really think it's just about them trying to, quote unquote, dismantle society, overturn norms, overturn social stability. Everything that we have known to this point is just for the sake of novelty and for the sake of creating destruction. But I would say with intersex, so you have as many as 30 different, I think there are just over 30 different variations of these conditions. So they can present as, say, ambiguous genitalia. Sometimes it's differences in terms of chromosome and chromosomal makeup. Sometimes it has to do with differences in exposure to hormones. But again, I don't think we have to reconceptualize biological sex in order to advocate for respect for this community.
I know I'm far from the only one, but I only discovered recently what it truly means to be intersex. Many years ago, I thought that being intersex means that you have both a vagina and a penis at the same time. But Dr. Debra, how does it actually work?
No, and I have to say myself also, I used to be very, very progressive. And I write in The End of Gender about how I used to be very much in favor of social justice and the myths. So I go through 9 different myths and debunk them. I used to believe many of those myths myself. I would just want to mention the point about gender. So because sex is binary, there's male and female. For over 99% of us, our biological sex and our gender identity are the same. And for trans people, obviously, it's the opposite. So if someone born male identifies as female, vice versa. So that, again, there are only 2 genders. There's not even non-binary. There's no such thing because there's no intermediate gamete between producing sperm or eggs that defines biological sex. But in terms of what you're saying with can people have 2 sets of genitalia? No, what you can have is a mix of tissue in terms of ovarian and testicular tissue. So typically people are born with either ovaries or testes, which you can have in some cases of intersex. So this is extremely uncommon. This is about 1 in 20,000 births. So it's very, very rare. You can have a situation in which someone is born and they have a mix of both ovarian and testicular tissue, or they can be born with 1 ovary and 1 testes, or they can be born with an ovary and a mix, or 1 testes and a mix. I really went digging into the research because I wanted to see. I keep hearing all about, how intersex is super common and that, people can be born with whatever activists say. And I could only find 1 case study of 1 individual with this presentation. And even in that case, someone who is intersex, they are not producing both sets of gametes. They're either producing eggs or they're producing sperm, or they're infertile. Again, I don't think we need to reconceptualize our basic understanding or what's backed by science in order to facilitate rights for a group. And I think it would be more productive to have that nuance in the discussion and say, yes, this is a small minority. They still deserve respect, and for us to, eliminate prejudice against them. Because when you start denying biology and you start denying science, people don't like that, understandably. And they also think that you don't know what you're talking about. So the first myth I would say that got really popular in our culture was gender is a social construct. And I remember thinking back then, when people claim this, most people know that's not true. Gender is not socially constructed. It's not that we learn our roles, male and female, based purely in society. There is some cultural element to it, but it's not purely determined by messaging that you receive growing up. And this, I would say, even for the case for trans people, there's a biological component to your gender identity. And I just remember thinking this is going to do such a disservice, because I think it's important to advocate for women's rights. It's interesting because in 2023, advocating for women's rights looks very different from what it looked like before I wrote this book, in terms of what we see happening with some trans women or self-identified trans women. I don't even know if they're trans, claiming that they should have access to women's spaces. And when you deny science, it doesn't matter what your intentions are or what your ultimate goal is, it really puts people off. And I think it's going to lead to a backlash.
My personal experience is acknowledging the truth about my situation is what set me free. I started to understand that there's no such thing as my truth. And what truly improved my mental health was when I started to accept that it's okay that I'm not a real man. It's okay that technically I'm a woman with a mental disorder. And that's a harsh reality for people like me. But it is the truth. Activists demand the truth to change. But unfortunately, they would never be satisfied. They would only be satisfied if they start to acknowledge how reality works.
Well, I also think for people who are trying to deny the truth or denying how they genuinely, whatever's really going on with them, because I do think with, say, gender dysphoria, I do think people who experience this are genuinely suffering, and we should have compassion for them. But if you're not really honest with yourself about where that's coming from, it's not going to make you feel better. Ultimately, you can try a bunch of different things, but if it doesn't actually target what it is that's leading to your unhappiness, you're going to still be having to deal with that indefinitely until you do figure that out.
You would find some studies in Dr. Debra's book that conclude that prenatal exposure to testosterone might influence masculine women's masculinity. I don't know about you, but I find that very interesting. So, how big of a role Does our biology, our nature, play in the way we express our gender?
So it speaks a little bit to what I was saying about this myth that gender is a social construct, because gender has to do with exposure to, or prenatal exposure to testosterone. So higher levels of exposure to testosterone is associated with more male typical behavior and interest, whether the fetus is male or female. And so, as you're saying, with, say, little girls who are exposed to higher than usual levels of testosterone, because most girls are exposed to, or women are exposed to lower levels of testosterone than men. But of the girls who are exposed to higher levels, they do tend to be more masculine in their interests, their behaviors. Even when they are born, they're very young, they are more male typical. So it's not accurate to say that, like I said, gender is due to purely social influence. What is considered masculine or feminine in society can be culturally influenced, but whether you gravitate towards what's considered masculine or feminine is biologically based. So the example I use in the book is, say, having a shaved head. That's considered masculine. So you see most men are going to have a shaved head, and the women who have shaved heads tend to be more masculine on average. And again, I'm talking about averages here. I'm not talking about any specific people or individual cases, because of course there are some, say, women who maybe have a shaved head and aren't necessarily more masculine, or there are always individual cases, but just by and large in terms of statistical averages. And so if we were to live in this alternate universe in which having a shaved head was seen as feminine, then you'd see most women would have a shaved head, and then the men who had shaved heads would be more feminine. And so similarly also with animal models, that testosterone exposure, lower levels in males, is associated with being attracted to males. So it's both gender identity and sexual orientation are linked, even though this is something that activists say they're completely separate things. And with regard to gender identity, so this exposure to testosterone can also influence it in terms of how someone feels about their gender. This is an interesting perspective when it comes to autogynephilia, because there's this narrative that trans women are women, full stop. And so with autogynephilia, for people who are watching or listening who may not have heard this term before, it translates from Greek to love of oneself as a woman. So this is the work of my friend and mentor, Dr. Ray Blanchard. He's a world-renowned psychologist at the University of Toronto. And basically, it's this idea that for some trans women, they find it sexually arousing to have the body of a woman, and also to do things that women typically do in society. And so I won't go into too much, because I go into the book, so I won't go into too much detail in terms of the typology. But basically, with trans women, there's a two-pronged typology. So of trans women who are sexually attracted to women, or to both men and women, this is autogynephilia. And I always want to emphasize, I don't judge anyone who has autogynephilia. Whatever people are into, that's their business. So long as it's consensual, I'm not here to judge anybody. And I would say many people who experience autogynephilia, they are not the super aggressive, angry activist type that you see out demanding crazy things, like wanting to be in women's sports or in women's prisons. Some people with autogynephilia will transition, and that will work for them, and I support them in that. Some people with autogynephilia just indulge in their personal lives. They don't fully transition. They don't necessarily come out as a woman or anything like that. So again, with this issue, I think there needs to be more nuance in that autogynephilia is unfairly demonized in some spaces, and then in other spaces it's completely denied, and people claim that this is a myth and that it's hateful and that's based on outdated research. It doesn't really exist. But I do think for many of these activists who claim that autogynephilia is quote unquote disgusting or whatever, it doesn't exist, I'm willing to bet that they experience it themselves, and maybe that is also inspiring them to be so adamant about the fact that it doesn't exist. And I wrote about this recently, actually, for the Washington Examiner, and how I feel that autogynephilia really is fueling trans activism at this moment. And like you said, I don't believe that trans activists speak for everyday trans people. I really try to emphasize that every time I do media, because I think it's important for the public to know. And it makes me very sad when people see what the activists are asking for, and they think that everyday trans people want these ludicrous things. And I would just ask them to please take it down a notch, just a little bit. You can still be vocal, but just not to the extreme that you're taking things at.
For all the activists who get triggered by these labels autogynephilia, rapid onset gender dysphoria, and so on, let me ask you, don't you know that we create these labels for your own good? Instead of spending all your energy and time on being offended, why don't you use that time and energy on working on yourself? The point of these labels is to help you and help your personal journey to happiness and inner peace.
Yeah, and I mean that's something I really admire in you when I hear you speak. You have this confidence and this self-assuredness that I imagine must have come with a lot of self-introspection and a lot of self-work. I think that's really amazing, and I wish that the people criticizing you could take something from that and say like, look, this is someone who's doing really well, very happy, instead of trying to bring someone like you down. Like that's what I find the most distasteful about activists. And it's not even just about this particular issue with gender. It's like wokeness and people who love to just attack other people or who build their platform or brand on tearing other people down. I just think it's such a waste of their time and their talent also. I'm sure, they have their own interests and joys in life. And why not spend your time focused on that and thinking about what you can do to foster that instead of looking at people around who are doing well and really just trying to make them feel badly.
And also, I don't understand how they're so against gatekeeping. Because if you're truly gender dysphoric, you would get your transition, no matter how much gatekeeping there is. So how about accepting that gatekeeping is a good thing because it will save a lot of people. They're in their little bubble and they don't think about other people. So, some of these activists don't. And I think it's sad also because gatekeeping is to figure out what's really going on with you. So why is that a bad thing to find out what's really going on with you? Because you can get help no matter what.
I think I understand their perspective in that I imagine it must be really frustrating and emotionally distressing to not be able to access something that you want and to have someone to, if you feel deeply within you that you need something to feel better and you're not able to get that, I can totally empathize with why that would make people really upset and feel like that process shouldn't exist and it should really just be about what the individual patient wants. But at the same time, especially when it comes to mental health issues, what someone wants may or may not actually be helpful for them or might not make them feel better. It might, but it also might not, especially when we look at kids. And so, my concern is especially with, I talk all the time about how there's so much comorbidity around children with gender dysphoria, especially nowadays. And the fact that this is something that's not being talked about and that it's considered hateful to even bring that up. And especially with kids, many of these children, it's about the family dynamic. It's about, right, being potentially on the autism spectrum, issues with their sexual orientation, not being comfortable with their body, which is very normal post-puberty. If there's a history of sexual trauma, it blows my mind how often I hear someone say that they've experienced sexual abuse before they transition and they detransition. It's so disappointing that young people are not getting the help that they need, especially when there are these red flags. And I feel I don't do clinical work anymore. I always want to be very clear about that. But there are certain things that when you hear someone say it, you should probably pay attention and ask questions.
I think the reason why woke activists are broadening the term trans is because they refuse to acknowledge that the mechanism that makes someone trans is a mental disorder. What activists forget is when you're ashamed or even refuse to acknowledge a gender dysphoria as a mental disorder, you are implying that there's something wrong with dealing with a mental disorder. And that doesn't make sense to me at all because we're living in a time where we're trying to destigmatize people who deal with mental health issues and mental disorders.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too that there are people who will identify as trans even though they don't have gender dysphoria. And I just think that's so disrespectful. And I think it also really makes light of the genuine pain and struggling that someone with gender dysphoria can experience. And it's like you said, it's this broadening of the term, especially with non-binary. There's no, from my understanding, most of these people don't seem to experience gender dysphoria. It's more like a fashion accessory. I think it's interesting because I've seen you critique some of the videos of people who identify this way. The brain is wired to recognize someone as male or female. There's no third category in between where the brain will say, oh yes, this person is non-binary. And so I see some non-binary people who identify as non-binary get very upset. They call it misgendering. I'm like, you can't use the word misgender to say that someone has identified you as male or female when you clearly look either male or female. It's like you said, they're culturally appropriating trans people. It's so ridiculous.
The last thing I talked to Dr. Debra Soh about was what's going to happen in the future. What does she hope the future will look like?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say that I'm straight, but I feel because I'm straight, I generally want to defer to what people in the community feel is good for them, because I don't want to seem like I'm speaking for people in the community. But as a former scientist, I would say my number one hope is that we can one day get back to just doing objective research, and that it's not going to be so heavily politicized, that scientists are not going to be terrified for their livelihoods if they produce work that upsets a particular group or upsets activists. I mean, nowadays, you can't even, I would say, even really brainstorm in terms of research. You have good researchers who do pursue work as objectively as they can, but they know they're going to be experiencing who knows how many hurdles that they would not be experiencing if they were saying things that activists liked. And so, my hope is that one day scientists will be able to do that research. It will get funded, published. If you have an issue, of course, you can debate that scientist, but the research needs to stand on its own. Those findings deserve to be published and put out into the public. People deserve to know the truth about these issues, because otherwise, if we're not basing policy and decisions on what's actually happening, and it's based on narratives and it's based on trying to appease particular groups, it's not actually going to be effective. It's not going to help people. It's going to potentially hurt people. And also, I think it makes people more skeptical of science as an endeavor, which I also think is not helpful. And this is not just in gender. We see this happening in a whole bunch of different areas. We see this happening with academia more broadly in terms of crazy wokeness coming in and the things that they are forcing professors and faculty to go along with in terms of, say, I won't get into diversity and equity and all that nonsense, but I would love for things just to return to a place where we can actually have a civil discussion with people we disagree with, because I think that's also very important.
Where can people find you, and where can people find your book?
You can find me at drdebrasoh.com. You can get The End of Gender on my website. You can get it on Simon & Schuster's website. The audiobook is free on Audible, and it is, as you mentioned, read by me. You can also find me on social media at Dr. Debra Soh.
A huge thank you to Dr. Debra Soh for being on this channel and for being so iconic. If you want to follow her work, I'll leave some links down below. And thank you for watching this video. As always, leave a comment down below and tell me what you think. Remember to like this video, hit subscribe and the notification bell. If you want, you can support me with a small donation under Super Thanks. It would mean so much to me. It would actually help me out a lot, so thank you on beforehand. And I'll see you all in my next video. Bye.